Okay, hi everyone. This is Annalisa from C.A.C. Global Solutions. This morning, I would like to talk to Bret about the webinars that we are going to have in October and November. Some of you may know that we're going to have on the 9th of October a webinar on aircraft management, Airworthiness management on the 23rd of October, 6th of November, flight operations management, and on the 27th of November, we're going to have transition aircraft management webinar. So, Bret, about aircraft management. So, I am coming from an industry perspective, and it's kind of a frustrating perspective because I've came across a lot of clients who didn't know what actually aircraft management is, and the entire situation made the management of the aircraft quite difficult. You, on the other hand, you have a huge experience as a aircraft manager, maintenance manager, but also as a surveyor for different civil aviation authorities. You have a different perspective on aircraft management. So I'm going to tell you what I think, and I would like your comments on it. Okay, so I think that aircraft management is not very well understood in terms of all the different steps and the characteristics of it that need to be understood, and they need to be understood on every level, meaning from the airworthiness engineer who is actually managing the airworthiness to the pilots that who are actually flying the aircraft, and up to the maintenance provider or the maintenance engineer of the company. And the reason is a lot of these characteristics of aircraft management are linked to each other. So, for example, I'll give you an example. When I manage shipboard operations, normally what I have seen is that those environments are managed by the pilot. And so the pilot is in charge of the scheduling of the flight activities. And for example, in my case, it was quite difficult sometimes to get an idea of the flight activity itself, which for me as an airworthiness engineer managing the airworthiness of the aircraft is extremely important to have, because I need to have a rough idea of the amount of flight hours that the helicopter is going to do. I need to know where the helicopter is going to be, more or less, because there are maintenance tasks that need to be done over a long and a short period of time. And I found that this tiny little thing was really difficult to make the client understand that I needed that information, and that he couldn't just manage the helicopter by himself and just cut me off and call me only when the certificate of airworthiness needed to be reissued. Okay, so what is your take?
Well, you put a lot in that little bit there, and we're talking about a vast subject. There are so many different aspects to it. The one thing that I kind of keyed on as you're talking there is everybody has their own specialty. That goes without saying. Pilots know what pilots do, engineers know what engineers do, and maintainers know what maintainers do. Problem is, everybody needs to have a healthy understanding, a rounded understanding of what each other does and how they interact with each other, or how they're supposed to, because as you mentioned in your example of onboard operations, you have a world that you take care of, and the pilot has a world that he takes care of. But if you don't have an understanding of each other's world, you don't understand what your role is in that part. For instance, the pilot, he's more concerned about when he needs to fly, where he needs to fly, what conditions he might need to fly in. Whereas he feels that he's been given a fully serviceable aircraft. He left dock on the ship with the aircraft serviceable. He hasn't broken it to his knowledge. If he has, he should have reported it. And right there, How does he report it? Who does he report it to? What needs to be reported? And so that's where you come into play. And also the ongoing serviceability of the aircraft is, as we all know, is more than just it was serviceable when I left, and if it breaks, then it's unserviceable. You know, a lot of things render an aircraft unserviceable, including scheduled maintenance that's not being done, or you know, conditions that the aircraft might have been subject to, you know, hard landing or high winds or whatever. I've seen examples where on the back of the boat, an aircraft, a helicopter is lashed down nice and secure, but they may have gale force winds, and now all of a sudden, you know, the pilot, he goes out and looks at it, and if he doesn't know any better, I'm not saying they all do this, but if he doesn't know any better, he may look at the aircraft and not see any visible damage and think, okay, I'm good, and not think twice about the fact that there may have been conditions that the aircraft was subject to that require actual maintenance inspections after the fact. So, you know, that's one example. I've seen it time and time again. I mean, from a regulator's perspective, of course, all we're concerned about is safety of the aircraft. And how do we do that? Well, technically, what they tell you is if you meet all of the regulatory requirements, that should ensure safety. Well, I think we all know that's not necessarily true either. Nonetheless, that's the biggest tool that we have to verify that the aircraft is being maintained in a safe manner, flown in a safe manner, managed in a safe manner. And the only way that we can do that is if everybody knows what everyone else needs to do and is aware of the requirements. You know, for instance, an aircraft has a circuit breaker pop and the pilot resets it. That's, in most cases, that's fully acceptable. And then it pops again and he resets it again. And everything goes well the rest of the flight. He gets home and reports to the maintainer that's there meeting the aircraft that all's good, everything worked well, except for the fact that the circuit breaker popped. But it never makes its way into the logbook. And so the next flight out, maybe there's a different crew and circuit breakers pop again. Well, now all of a sudden the circuit breakers pop 3 times, at least that we know of, but technically it hasn't been recorded, so there's no way of following that. So, you know, little things that the pilots may think are little, and are required to do, as in recording a defect. If they don't know the relevance of it, then they may not think too much about it. You know.
Yeah, and that's the reason why we are going to do a flight operations management in respect to aircraft management with Captain Lindsay Cadenhead, for this reason, because there are a lot of things that pilots should be aware of that are going to affect the other entities, the other parties involved in the aircraft management. And a couple of points that I wanted to make. So one first big issue that we come across, in my opinion, in understanding aircraft management is due to the fact that some regulations don't have a clear description of aircraft management and what actually that is. So practical example, EASA regulation has a very specific regulation for airworthiness management. So right there, you have a chance to know what actually a part of aircraft management, which is airworthiness, because the regulation tells you that. Okay, so other regulations don't have that. So it is embedded in the regulation, but it's not clear. And the other thing is that a lot of people don't read the regulation. It's quite boring and sometimes can be convoluted. So in my experience, I saw a lot of people just doing what they've always been doing, even though they work maybe in a different environment with a different regulation. So they don't understand that actually requirements can be different from the previous environment. So first of all, for me, there is the first issue is the requirements. The aviation requirements should be more specific, and should also, I would say, require staff to have kind of an aircraft management course to understand what the aircraft management world is about. But moving on to another thing that you mentioned is about reporting defects. So this is one of the things that we are going to talk about with Captain Lindsay Cadenhead. But yeah, I've worked with a couple of pilots who didn't really understand why for example, I remember one telling me, well, I don't know why I should insert all this information about fuel and stuff like that, which I find it funny because it's quite standard for in a lot of regulations to add that box in the technical logbook. And it is important for a number of reasons, but that, reporting defects, if you don't know about that something is not working, you can't do anything about it, right? Until it's too late. So this is something that we are going to talk in our flight operations webinar. But another point that I wanted to make that it came to me while you were talking is about airworthiness and the role of a airworthiness engineer that very often is not understood. And again, partially is because the lack of clear guidance in the regulation. I had this case where the helicopter was registered in the Cayman Islands. So the Cayman Islands require you to have a CAMO, but also what they call a technical coordinator. But it's important to understand that the responsibility of the airworthiness stays with the CAM organization and not the technical coordinator. Anyhow, there was the COA renewal coming up, and the helicopter was doing maintenance, and the person who went on site to meet the surveyor was the technical coordinator and not the CAM engineer. And that created a number of problems because the technical coordinator didn't know anything about certain specifics of the aircraft, of what was going on during the maintenance visit. And that created some findings that then the airworthiness engineer had to clarify with the Civil Aviation Authority. This wouldn't have happened if the CAMO engineer would have already been on site and talked directly to the authority. So what do you think about this example?
Yeah, no, that's a good example. I mean, the whole concept of airworthiness management is a little misunderstood. And like you say, I think a good part of it is because some regulation doesn't really spell it out. C.A.C is quite prescriptive in what they expect, what they want, and what has to be in place. If you're dealing with the FAA or Transport Canada, the requirements are still there. A lot of people don't understand that all of the pieces that the C.A.C requires everything is driven by what the ICAO recommendations are. So everybody has these pieces, but if you don't spell it out, they may be doing some of these aspects, but not understand that, well, that's what you call it, right? For instance, like you mentioned technical coordinator. In some instances, under some regulations, a technical coordinator is the person that's actually responsible for making sure that the aircraft is managed appropriately. Well, in other regulations or other requirements, the technical coordinator, his or her only responsibility is to ensure that appropriate arrangements are in place. And in a lot of cases, the way they do that is by engaging a continuing airworthiness management organization, like you say, whereby the CAMO, they're now responsible for the airworthiness of the aircraft. They have airworthiness engineers that are intimate with the aircraft. One aircraft maintenance engineer may be responsible for one single aircraft, or may be responsible for a number of aircraft under the umbrella of the CAMO. Now, if you're dealing in a C.A.C world, in Transport Canada world or FAA world, a lot of times, you see in the FAA world, repair stations managing the airworthiness of the aircraft. And it's not that that's unacceptable, you know, and this is something we have to be careful of, because again, you have to be respectful of the regime under which you're operating. So in the FAA world, that may be perfectly acceptable, but the pieces all have to still be there and be managed appropriately. You know, for a repair station to think that all they need to do is repair any defects that the aircraft comes in with and leave it at that, or look at a list of ADs and repair the defects, and that's all good enough. Truthfully, that's not the whole picture, because there may be other aspects that affect the airworthiness of the aircraft, that if you just drop into an AMO and say, hey, I'm due for such and such a check, please do it, and check the ADs, that's not the whole picture of continuing airworthiness. So, you know, again, it depends what regulation you're operating under. And that's the thing, is every person that's either managing the aircraft, maintaining the aircraft, or operating the aircraft has to be at least somewhat familiar with the requirements under which they're operating, or under, and this kind of goes into, you know, for instance, with an FAA repair station, some regulatory authorities allow their aircraft, different state aircraft, to be maintained, for instance, under an FAA repair station. Well, that's all fine, but that FAA repair station needs to be aware of the requirements under which that aircraft is being maintained or managed, and they need to respect those. And this is where we start seeing problems, and is when it's a lack of understanding is all it really is. I mean, on the other side, I've seen some aircraft maintenance organizations where you go in with a foreign aircraft and they've got everything laid out as far as what the requirements are, what a logbook sign out needs to be as far as a statement, a release statement, the different requirements that are in effect, and the fact that they have to interact with the camo, because under that particular regulation, it's required that the camo actually makes the request for whatever maintenance actions need to be accomplished. And, you know, truthfully, maintainers typically are only responsible for what is requested of them. So, and you, as an operator and as a continuing airworthiness management organization, you have to keep that in mind, because if you write a work order, or you enter a contract for maintenance and you specify one thing, that's what you're going to get. And that's all that the MRO is responsible for.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I have seen that myself. So another point that I want to say is when you go, for example, in a FAA repair station, and they just kind of drop the aircraft, and the repair station does whatever they think it's needed. You do have to understand, as a repair station, that you are taking some responsibility, some liability on that aircraft when you decide what needs to be done and what is not, and what doesn't need to. And often these decisions are driven also by the software that is kind of used to manage the aircraft. But again, the software and the software provider, the analyst is called, that is inputting once in a while data on in the software, is not responsible for airworthiness. So the analyst or the repair station, they do not know the aircraft configuration. So in particular, if you don't stay with one particular repair station, but you just go with different repair station based on where you are located or the need of the aircraft, that means that you have different repair stations putting their hands on your aircraft and doing modifications. And those modifications, for example, they need to be tracked. So once you change repair station, the new repair station don't know what you have done to your aircraft. They don't have the time or the possibility to go through the aircraft technical records and see what happened. So normally they just do what is expired or is going to expire from the software that is used to manage the aircraft. But even then, again, and I this is a very important point, in my opinion, to understand, because I've seen it firsthand, is that the software or the analyst that comes with the software that you use to manage your aircraft is not responsible for airworthiness. They are not going to talk to the CAA about your COA renewal or an extension or anything. They just input data, but then you as a airworthiness engineer, you have to evaluate those data and see if those modification or whatever they are applicable to your aircraft or not. So when a repair station takes on this kind of work, is just go through the software and see what is applicable, what is not. They are taking in some liability, in my opinion. So they should be a little careful.
The the MROs do to a degree take on liability, of course, but you have to keep in mind, and this is where it really needs to be defined who's responsible for the airworthiness of the aircraft. Because if I drop my aircraft into an MRO and say replace the right hand main wheel, number 4 main wheel, and because it's got a scuff mark on it, and that's what I do, that's all I'm responsible for. So that's one aspect. I mean, that's a very simple one. But if, like you say, if I drop my aircraft off there and I say, I think it's due for maintenance, please check the software provider's, the camp analyst report. Well, they're, yes, they become responsible for that activity. I mean, that's what you've requested of them. If now you run into all kinds of other potential issues here, because like you say, if you're going from MRO to MRO and different people are maintaining your aircraft, it's also, like you mentioned, the software provider, all they're doing is maintaining a database based on the information that they're being provided with, garbage in, garbage out. So if the last MRO did some troubleshooting, or they did a component replacement, and they may have made an entry in the logbook, but they didn't fill out the software report card, whatever have you. And so there, the software analyst isn't aware of that change, so he doesn't update it. So now you go to the next MRO and you say, please make sure I'm current with everything. And they pull down the software report for the aircraft. And it looks like this component hasn't been replaced because there's no report of it being replaced. So, there you get into all kinds of issues. This is an efficiency issue where maybe costing the owner of the aircraft and that the cost of another component, because they're replacing something that was just replaced, but they have no knowledge of it. And there goes $40,000, right? So, I mean, that's a whole different aspect. It's not an airworthiness aspect as far as making sure that the aircraft is serviceable. But this is an example of where, aircraft owners need to be aware of all of these issues as well, right?
Yeah. And that reminds me of something that happened to me, that when I took on a business jet, they had this expensive modification done on the engine, and that wasn't a mandatory modification, it was just a recommended. But again, because before the aircraft was FAA under the FAA registry, and they were just the pilot just parked the aircraft there to the maintenance organization, and the maintenance organization decided what to do, and they just decided to embody a very expensive service bulletin that actually wasn't needed. So yeah, it's there are a lot of layers to it. It's not to aircraft management is and yeah, everybody should really be from the owner to to the pilot, to the maintenance engineer. They should all understand what the dynamic of aircraft management is. So just one more thing about transition aircraft. So we have seen, because of all the things that have happened around the world in the last 4 years, a lot of aircraft changing from coming back to the lessor and then being redelivered. So what do you think about the dynamic of this transition aircraft? Is there anything in particular? We are going to have a webinar on this on November 27th. Is there anything that you can say about this briefly?
Well, from my experience, and I've been involved with quite a number of transition aircraft. The biggest concern that I have from a regulator perspective is the interaction between the dynamic and the interaction between the lessor, the MRO, and the continuing airworthiness organization. Because what I've seen is typically when an aircraft is in transition, it gets input for maintenance because, well, one, it needs to continue to be maintained in a serviceable condition, or at least at some point it needs to be rendered serviceable. So it's going to undergo maintenance. But quite typically, with transition aircraft, you're always looking at the end goal, and the end goal is transitioning the aircraft onto another register. So a lot of times, not just the other register, but the airline that might be taking the aircraft on, they may have regulatory requirements for certain equipment, or they might just have livery changes, or whatever the case might be. And so that will all have to be catered for in a maintenance visit. So one of the biggest things that we see is aircraft that are in maintenance for transition. The camos typically are the ones that are supposed to be making up the work order. The MROs are generally fully aware of this. Most camos and MROs have input meetings where the lessor is the owner of the aircraft, they're present, the camo representative is present, and the MRO is present. And they all discuss what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, and when it needs to be done, all of the specifics. But the one aspect that I think is not fully understood is that if a camo is involved, the request for whatever work is to be accomplished must come from the camo. So in that respect, what we see is a lot of times the lessors have their own representatives on site, and the representatives are fully intimate with the aircraft. They've been following it for quite some time, most likely much longer than the actual camo that's engaged. But so they're intimate with the aircraft. They're hands-on, they're on site, they see things that may come up in real time, and they go directly to their client, who is the owner of the aircraft, the lessor, and say, we've got this issue. This is what I think we should do with it, or these are our options. And they let the lessor decide. And then they go back to the MRO and they say, okay, the owner wants to do this. So the MRO, they think that's their marching orders, and they jump right into it because their commercial contract is with the owner of the aircraft, the lessor. So that's who they think is supposed to be calling the shots. So what they're doing there is they're cutting the camo out of the loop. The camo is the only entity involved in this whole project that has full picture of the airworthiness of the aircraft, the configuration, everything about it. And by short circuiting the process, you're potentially inducing an area for an unsafe activity, an unsafe action to take place. So, it may be that something is being embodied that shouldn't be embodied because it's incompatible with the configuration of the aircraft. And furthermore, you're not maintaining the aircraft in accordance with the regulation. The regulation says that the work request comes from the camo. If the work request is coming directly from the owner of the aircraft and the camo has no knowledge of it, I've seen situations where the aircraft is ready to be released and the camo files their final report and they're going through the MRO's reports, and there's work there that was done that they weren't aware of at all. And right there, you've got some issues, regulatory issues. One aspect that we talk about quite a bit is liability and insurance. If aircraft insurance, in most cases, if you look closely at the policies, if it's not maintained in accordance with the regulations, the insurance can be void. So, even in a situation like that, it's unlikely, but the potential is there. So, there's all kinds of aspects that have to be taken into consideration.
Yeah. Well said. So, this and more is going to be in our webinar about transition aircraft. So once again, we're going to start with aircraft management on October 9th. Airworthiness Management on October 23rd, Flight Operations Management with Captain Lindsay Cadenhead on November 6th, and Transition Aircraft webinar on November 27th. I hope you enjoyed this little discussion with Bret. Thank you so much for watching, and bye for now.